Hello and welcome everyone to the Whole Energy Body Balance podcast, where we explore all kinds of possibilities, practices and philosophies that bring greater healing, connection and harmony to pets, people and horses. So we aim to inspire you. We may well challenge you a little bit in a beautiful way, and we really want to inspire you to grow and create positive changes and healing in your life and in the lives of all the beings you care for. So if you're interested in that, you're in a good place. I'm your host, Dr. Edward, the healing vet, and I help deeply caring people, pets and horses unfold profound healing and healthy relationships through somatic awareness, loving therapeutic touch, intuitive perception, kind training and energy work. I also practice worldwide as an intuitive, integrative veterinarian and healer, helping people, pets and horses. So we've got Andrew Hale with us, who is started off as a psychologist, yeah?
That's right, human with humans.
Human psychologist, and now is a certified canine behaviourist, and he's the behavioural consultant for Pet Remedy, proud to be an expert advisor for canine arthritis management and a Kids Around Dogs trainer. And Andrew has a business called Dog Centered Care, which focuses on supporting a dog-led, emotionally centered approach to providing the best care and support for dogs and their caregivers. And what we're going to be doing today is exploring the emotional experience together. But before we start that, we always start with this question, which is, Andrew, who are you? Why do you do what you do? And how did you get to this point in your life?
Well, thanks for having me, Edward. And that's a very deep place to start, isn't it? Who am I? Oh my God, that's very profound. So I think I've got a human psychology background, and I made the shift over to animals. Actually, that all came about because of my own breakdowns. I had a really big breakdown, mental health breakdown in my 30s, very much based on my trauma as a child, and this is what I'm very. It's all connected, though. I share those things because it's relevant to the story, I guess. Because I mean, we can unpack that a little bit in a bit. But so I was working in human psychology, human therapy, and then I had my breakdown, and then I had something like a breakdown to help you to reevaluate life, and then I made a shift over to working with animals, and that's why I think I'm really passionate about. The one thing that's kind of connected through all along is this real interest in the individual lived emotional experience, whether that's a human or the animal. I focus in specifically on dogs now, but it doesn't matter whether it's a dog, a cat, or a horse. We all share three very fundamental things for me. The need to feel heard. We all want to feel heard, especially when we're trying to communicate need. We all want to feel safe, physically safe, of course, but emotionally and socially safe, especially. And we all want to find relief. For me, Edward, it's one of the most important words in the psychology of behavior, really, is the notion of relief. Because when you experience something, especially something that isn't particularly pleasant, physical pain, emotional pain, social pain, whatever, you seek relief. And a lot of challenging behaviors that we see in young children and animals are actually just relief-seeking behaviors. So there's a connection there for me with all those things. So that's kind of who I am and why I do what I do. And a lot of it, like as is often the case, a lot of my motivations in life, even going down I look back now and recognize even pursuing human psychology, was more about finding myself underneath stuff, and understanding my trauma, understanding what happened to me, and so that's it's all very neat, really. In that case, really, a lot of threads there, but they all kind of tie together.
Okay, so with the emotional experience of beings, and I think we can confidently say that humans and animals have very similar kinds of emotional experiences. What are the major emotions that you understand and can see and work with in the dogs that you're working with?
I think it's worth framing the emotional experience before we go into some of the more specifics, because this is the big thing for me. The emotional experience lens is the one that I like to look through, because, like you say, we all have an emotional experience. So that emotional experience is, how we feel, how we get affected by things, how we cope with things, the different things that motivate us, all these kind of things. It's that experience of how we feel. And especially with animals, there's been this thing that's been said in the past, well, it still gets said now, that, well, we don't know how animals think and feel, so we're not going to go there. That's changed a bit over time, but that has ended up with a focus on just looking at changing behaviour. So we don't know how they think and feel, so we're just going to look at their behavioural output. Can we get more of it, or can we get less of it? Mm-hmm. But the thing is about the emotional experience, we all have one. The horse has one, the dog, the cat, us. But the second thing about it is unique to us as an individual. We are all a unique combination of our genetics, our early experiences, our trauma, our secure and insecure attachments, our learning histories, all these kind of things, come together, which is why, it's complicated. So the point there is, whilst, yes, I don't know how a dog, in this case, talking about dogs, thinks and feels, but the point is, Edward, I don't know how you think and feel. That's the point. So do I ignore that and just make you do stuff and behave in a way that I deem to be appropriate? Or do I find ways of finding out more about how you think and feel as an individual? There are a lot of things that connect us, of course. And I think when we think about, the primary emotional states of feeling anger and fear and joy and all these kind of things, I think we can look at that. But for me, it's a case of utilizing what science gives us. But especially when I'm working with the dogs I work with, I want that dog. Yeah, I'm quite happy with the study of one, as I say. I don't necessarily wait for the next paper to come out to tell me something. It's more of actually, especially on the emotional side of things, I'm just waiting for science to kind of. Yeah, exactly. So I think it's important to be led by the science, but not necessarily defined by it. I think we have to be mindful of that. So that's just my personal view on it. But so that's the thing about the emotional experience. It's we all have one, and we have to be mindful. For me, there's all these different camps out there regarding behaviour, all these different kind of philosophies, ideologies, and scientific disciplines. The same happens in human side of things as well as animal behavioural science. For me, there's only two types of behaviour. I think when we see it like this, we then start to really understand why we have to think about things, especially when working with animals in a slightly different way. The first is the behaviour we judge in others, and we have to understand what that's about and the problems that come with that. And secondly, the behaviour we do ourselves. We are kind of designed to judge. Our brains like to judge, and especially we create this kind of safe worldview, if you like, especially as adults, based on our belief systems, our value systems, and our brain doesn't want to have to change that very much. Appraisals, cognitive reappraisal is quite difficult. So actually, a lot of the judgments we make about another, so I was saying a minute ago about, do I get you to behave based on my judgments of what is safe and right and everything else, and this brings us on to that kind of good bad continuum, which we can look at in a minute. But when we think about the behaviour we do ourselves, guess what? It's complicated. It's complicated. That's the point. And our behavioural outputs get more, especially for us as humans, because a lot of our behavioural outputs are managed and moulded through societal conformist norms.
Yep.
So I think when we start thinking about these things, then it starts to open up how important it is if we are going to turn up to influence, change, modify, or whatever the behavior of another living sentient being. We need to be really aware of what we're doing and what that behavior actually represented for that animal in the first place, or the human, indeed.
Yeah, I like to think of the word inspire. I want to inspire animals to change their behavior. I know it's a little change in language, but it implies that they want to change, that there's value in them changing,
I like that. And I think I use the word invitation. I think it's a similar kind of thing. Everything has to be an invitation. But I think, yes. And the thing is, when we think about what behavior is, what it represents, behavior is an expression of need, the need to connect, especially if you're social, the need to feel safe, as we talked about a minute, physical, emotional, social safety, the need to find relief. And also behavior is an expression of self. We don't talk about that enough. As a member of the LGBTQ community, it's interesting. If we think, I mentioned about the good-bad continuum, it might be worth framing that a little bit now, actually, because we're all indoctrinated in the good-bad continuum, which is this notion that somehow behavior is good through to bad. And underpinning that is a big societal focus on rewarding the good and punishing or ignoring, depends on what your view is, the bad.
Yeah.
And that sounds so compelling, doesn't it? It's like, well, we want more of the good. Of course, we want less of the bad. Until we ask the simple question, who's deciding what is good and bad? This comes back to those two types of behavior, the behavior we judge in others, behavior we judge us. So who's deciding what's good or bad? How representative of that is based on the actual needs of the other that we've decided is bad. So as I say, as a member of the LGBTQ community, I know that, I'm married now with my husband and it's all wonderful. But literally 60, 70 years ago, I could have gone to prison for the expression itself. So I think this is important. We've got to start thinking about these different components, about the richness of the individual lived experience. And whilst having the objective is important, and I think definitely in dog training, we needed the science at one point because it was a bit of a wild west at one point. We needed some of the science. I think it's gone the other way a little bit. I think we've almost weaponized the science a little bit in that thing. But the objective is important, but the richness of the individual lived experience lies in the subjective and the anecdotal, actually. That's that study.
I agree. So what is your objective when you meet a dog? And I know you work with a lot of dogs that are inverted commas, dangerous, aggressive, that sort of thing. What's your objective for the dog when you meet a dog? Just taking a short little break from the actual podcast itself. Thanks so much for listening. I just wanted to let you know that I have a modality, whole energy body balance, that I've created over 28 years of working with all kinds of animals with all kinds of problems. And if you want to learn how to get your beautiful hands on your pets to find and heal their silent pain, anxiety and trauma, or if you would like to wake up your intuitive perception and learn how to use energy healing to find and heal all kinds of problems and distresses and traumas in your pet's energy systems, then pop into wholeenergybodybalance.com. We've got home and practitioner programs so you can learn either to help your pets or you can get certified and build a beautiful business out playing with dogs and cats all day. It's a stack of fun. And now we'll head back to the podcast.
For me, it's no different to working with humans in many ways. I think I have my learn, support, teach mantra. So my first thing is to learn from the dog first. Learn from the dog first. Really important. I've shared it in some of the talks I've given with footage of either some of the dogs that I work with that are already struggling, but also even with young puppies. I do a lot of support work. I do consultation with a couple of the big assistance dog trainers here in the UK, and we're completely redoing what happens in that first 12 months, because once we start thinking about things differently, everything we traditionally do in that first 12 months with a dog, not everything, but a lot of it, we have to rethink it because it's not helpful. Because a lot of the things that we teach dogs through training has a little intrinsic value to the dog.
Yeah.
So that's a problem then, because for the dog's point of view, they want to feel safe, they want to find relief, they want all these kind of things. Learn, support, teach is what I tend to look at. So I've got to learn from the dog first. I need to learn as much as I can from that dog without influencing them too much. I see behavior a little bit like painting a picture. I need that dog to paint that picture for me. And I've got to resist the temptation to try and grab the brush off them and think I can paint the picture better. And of course, if you've got a dog who's potentially dangerous, we have to mitigate for that. But I just really want the dog to behave. I want them to feel they can behave. No dog is safer to be around by being made to feel less safe. And part of that thing about feeling safe is being able to communicate. And they have to communicate. So learn from the dog first. Learn. And there are 3 really important words for trying to understand safety in another, especially one who can't talk to you directly, and that is their processing, engagement, and exit preferences. So how do they need to process the world? What do they need to do to process? How much do they need to process? How well is that sensory integration process working? What is stopping them from being able to process well? I've got my doors of the brain analogy for processing. So if you imagine the dog's brain, same goes for the horse, same goes for us, by the way. If you imagine the brain has lots of little doors in it, it needs many doors to be open for that brain to have a chance of being able to process well, and for the sensory integration process to work well. Pain, trauma, stress, physical pain, emotional pain, social pain, all big door closers. I mean, we know that ourselves.
Because they increase arousal, and as arousal increases, well, when you get to a certain threshold of arousal, you start to lose cognitive capacity, right?
Exactly. And the thing is with doggies, especially, is what you've got to recognize is the first doors that are likely to start closing when that elevation, that arousal happens, are likely to be the training doors that we put training behind, because they have little intrinsic value to the dog. The doors that are likely to stay open are the survival doors, right? And this is why it's really challenging, because the caregiver, the general public have been convinced that the most important thing, Edward, is a well-trained, obedient dog. So we've already got a big hurdle now.
Oh, God, yes. Oh, God, yes. I actually love it when my dogs disobey me, consciously, deliberately, decide not to do what I ask them. I think that's incredibly beautiful most of the time.
Well, exactly. I think we have to. This is the thing. Everything's about balance, of course. But I think, and it is. Molly, who's our younger dog. We brought her up in a very naturalistic way, and that first 12 months we didn't, in inverted commas, train her anything. But that didn't mean she wasn't learning. She was learning all the time, and she was learning fundamentally important things. She learned that she had a voice, and a big one. She learned that she could have safety on her terms, and importantly, that my husband and I were her return to safety. This is really important. We'll perhaps come on to this in a bit, because social attachment is key on so many levels, and is so connected to not only emotional and social safety, but also physical health. Now we know this. We know so much about this. So so learn from dogs. So processing. How does the dog process stuff? So how does the dog process me? How does the dog process the environment? An important why is that dog unable to process some things at some points? And that's where pain comes in often. Trauma. Nothing closes doors like trauma, and you can't force those doors open. Taking a truly trauma-informed approach, the first thing we think about is not add more trauma. Well, how can you do that unless you are able to back off and just learn what you can? So learning is really important for the dog. I think part of the problem, with dog training specifically, it's like, I know what I'm going to do straight away. I'm going to dive in and do some training because I have the knowledge the dog has to learn. We've got to turn it around. We've got to learn from the dog first, even the puppy. So Molly came to us at 16 weeks. She'd already had 2 homes. She was a very fizzy puppy. We had to learn from her first, and there's a lot that we learn from her. So learn, then support. Once we've learned that stuff, then we can support what we've learned, and a big part of it is doing things like gait analysis and all this kind of stuff, so we can think about whether the dog might be uncomfortable physically, but also look for those signs of that dog not processing well socially, not doing social threat evaluation very well, whatever it is that we do through our observations, just taking our time to spend lots of time observing a dog. So if I've got a dog who struggles around other dogs, for example, the last thing I want to do is see the dog around other dogs yet. I want to spend a lot of time just seeing them in other contexts, because there's a richness to their lived experience that I can learn from. So learn, support. And then the final thing is teach. If I am going to teach anything, I want to try and make sure that I'm teaching things that are intrinsically valuable to that dog. not just getting them to do something else instead. And this is a big thing, I think, for positive reinforcement trainers to understand, and that is the coercive potential of reinforcement. If we're just
of either positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement, they can both be coercive, right?
Well, yeah, of course. And I think this is the key. I think there's a great saying in human psychology, which is the path to coercion can often be laid with good intention.
Oh, yes.
So we have to be mindful of that. So just because we can get another behaviour doesn't mean necessarily that the dog is finding the relief they were seeking, feel any safer, whatever it is, So we just have to be mindful of stuff. So we have a better chance at working by this by taking our time, slowing things down, doing good observations. I follow a lot of kind of sensory mapping stuff. We're just trying to get the brain to map stuff as we build things up. So that's how I kind of approach things with dogs. And they have a survival story to tell us, Edward. This is the point. And I think we need to try and work that out as best we can.
So I'd be curious then, you have to have boundaries as well. So how do you find a healthy way to express boundaries with dogs, with puppies, that you might need them to be out of your personal space for a period of time, or, whatever?
Yeah, boundaries are important, but they shouldn't be barriers to unmet need. That is the important thing. So I think what we have to recognize, especially all the everything pins back to the importance of secure attachments. When obviously John Bowlby came out with the initial kind of attachment ideas and the notion of secure base, but he was very much influenced by the studies that have been happening on animals. So he took those and thought about the mother and infant. And then it was Mary Ainsworth, who doesn't get talked about enough, really. But she worked with John Bowlby, but she kind of built on this notion of attachment. And actually, she took herself over to Africa because she was very aware of her kind of cultural bias in the West. And she said, well, I'm going to go and look at how they bring up children in Africa. And she really saw this connection, this way of putting the child, those child social needs at the forefront. And literally wasn't just the mom, it was other women in the village, if you like, all supporting to make sure that child felt secure. And Mary Ainsworth added to the kind of work that John Bowlby did by looking at different types of insecure attachments. It's interesting that a big meta-analysis was done looking at criminals, violent criminals in the States and Europe, and looking at all these different studies on there were male population in the prisons, but 70% across the whole meta-analysis identified as having insecure attachments.
Wow.
And it makes sense, really, because if you feel at a young age that your attempts to connect with another are either not forthcoming, or even worse, having the abuse put to you physically, emotionally, whatever else, then it's hard to think that you can get another to care. I share a little story with you here, because my husband's he's a hospice nurse. He's an end-of-life nurse.
Yeah.
And this is going back quite a few years now, but one of the local prisons had a violent offender in there, and who was end of life, and they couldn't look after their symptoms within the hospital at the prison. So they arranged for this prisoner to come to the hospice. So the hospice became a de facto prison, if you like. Well, that particular room did anyway. Yeah. So my husband was giving him care, this gentleman, and at first he was very dismissive of Kieran, very cold, very whatever. It was all very challenging. But my husband's amazing at his job. So as the days went on, he became more open to the care of my husband. And there was a big moment when he said to my husband, once they'd made a connection, that he said to my husband, "You're one of the first person who's ever cared."
Oh, wow.
That when Kieran told me that, I said, "Go back to this," that really hit me, and it showed the challenges for us as a society, both with obviously on the human side, but also with dogs, actually, because remember, a lot of the stuff that we learnt about attachment, social pain, social processing, we learned from studies on predominantly monkeys and dogs. So the social pain hypothesis came directly from dogs. That's Panskep. He took puppies away from mom, very upset. Then they injected the puppies with a mild opioid, and the puppies seemed to cope better. And he hypothesized that maybe social pain was like physical pain. Jump forward to modern day, Matthew Lieberman, Naomi Eisen. How is it? I can't quite remember her name, surname. But anyway, Naomi. It'll come to me. But anyway, Matthew Lieberman's well over at UCLA in the States. They've proven that now with the fMRI. Moving on even more now we recognise that social exclusion, loneliness, if you like, social rejection. So going back to Matthew Lieberman, they literally found that the part of the brain that dealt with physical pain and social pain overlapped because it hurts. And it's supposed to, coming back even more to the forefront now, is the evidence seems to show that when we experience chronic social detachment, loneliness, if you like, our inflammatory system gets dialed up and our antiviral system gets dialed down. Now, all this stuff, if you take it all in its entirety, it makes sense because as a social species, if I'm detached from my social secure base, my body's going to think, right, well, there's no point being protected against antiviral stuff because I'm not around anybody, but I'm possibly going to get attacked by something, so I better get my inflammatory system ready, just in case. It makes sense. The need for secure attachment as a social species, even when you think about polyvagal theory and the social element of that, this notion that we reach out to our social network. This is your area, I know. And if that fails, then we're more likely to go into that other thing. If you look at all the bits, it makes sense. And I think for dogs, then, we are, with a lot of the things we do with this big focus on training and obedience primarily. Remember, the general public have been convinced that's the most important thing. So they know how to teach sit and to get it all the flipping time, regardless, right? But they don't know about pain, about stress, about social connection, social processing, development stages. So actually, that everybody's being failed here a little bit, especially the dog, because a lot of those behaviours that are being seen as difficult, challenging, dominant, in inverted commas, are actually
we'll have to talk about the idea of dominance and the alpha and stuff in a minute, because that's another very, very deep misunderstanding that humans have with dogs, hey?
Well, yeah, I think that's it's probably one of the most damaging things that we can think of. Social hierarchies exist, of course they do, and dogs, as they do with us. But actually, all the kind of things show that it's more on a deference is a better word than dominance.
Yes.
Sure.
Oh, that's a great word. I'm going to use that one. And just to loop back a little bit to what you're saying about the whole social thing, I think there was some other research with rats that were given access to drugs, and if they're on their own, they became junkies. But if they had other rats, they weren't interested in the drugs, which I think is another very interesting piece of research.
Yes, it's a brilliant piece of research, because the kind of received wisdom was, and this is part of the problem with the more kind of set in stone behaviorism model, really, because you've got a rat there, they've got a choice between normal water and water with cocaine in it, and they went for the cocaine because it made them feel great, and that's reinforcing them, and it's all great. So that was how it was looked at. And a lot of I say this as somebody who has had a drug addiction himself, actually that's part of my breakdown. So I feel this quite deeply, actually, this notion that it's just the fact that it makes you feel good that and you're kind of connect to the feeling. No, it's about lack of connection elsewhere, and that's what was shown with the experiment. Because I can't remember who it was now, but the person doing the research created like Rat City, right? It was just amazing. It was just this great place with all loads of stuff going on. The rats still weren't interested in it because they had a connection, they had friends, they had things to do, and so it's important. And I think, showing a bit on my own little story a little bit here, just going back a bit, because I think it's relevant again. I had sexualized trauma as a child with non-family members. I always like to mention that. Now, before that happened, I had everything as a kid. My parents were amazing. lots of love. It was all fantastic. The thing about trauma, Edward, is nothing actually changes around you. My parents were the same. My family was the same. My school. What changes is your perception of stuff. This is really important. My perception of the world around me fundamentally changed then. This is that thing about feeling safe, and I felt very unsafe, of course. And my behaviour changed. My behaviour changed in a big way. I became very disruptive. I became very challenging, all the kind of things we want to do. My school took quite punitive approach, really. So I got into more and more trouble until eventually I got the cane. We used to hit kids with sticks back in the day. But yeah, so I had that. And guess what? Didn't want to be hit with a stick anymore. So my behaviour changed. So punishment works because it does.
But did your internal state change?
Well, this is the point. It didn't. And my behaviour changed at school through punishment. My father had a different approach because he recognised the reason I had everything as a kid was because my parents worked very hard and they were very successful and they were away doing stuff a lot. And my father thought my behaviour change was actually because I was kind of rebelling against them not being there so much. So he's like, you know what, we're going to do more as a family. I'm going to do less at work, contingent on you behaving. So guess what? Again, my behaviour changed because I wanted their love. And this is the thing about...
But again, it wouldn't have resolved the trauma, right? And that's probably why eventually you crashed and burned. And, I had... I went to boarding school at the age of 12. I grew up on the cattle property and did school by mail and radio before that, had an idyllic childhood, and then went to this hellscape. So I have some similarity in understanding how my, similar experiences. Yeah.
That must have been a huge adjustment then, because I think, when you had that secure base, when you had that safety, and then literally a car ride, and then everything changes. It's quite dramatic. It's not a gradual thing.
It was. I mean, there were some other issues with my family of origin and attachment and stuff there, but comparatively, it was really beautiful. Yeah. And what's more, my mum said, it's going to be fun. It's going to be lovely at boarding school. You're going to really enjoy it. Oh, my God.
Well, I think this comes back to that thing about what we judge for others and what we do ourselves, and projection. A lot of projection about our own perceptions of safety. The thing about safety is, when we think about safety in another, we tend to think in terms of physical safety because that's what our brain can get feedback from. But our own brain is more interested in emotional and social safety. And this is why we can be safe physically, but not feel it. The wonderful Rachel Leather, who's a trauma expert, she was a human trauma expert, and now she works with animals. She says the problem is you can't teach safety because the other has to feel it. That's really important.
And I suppose that, you're two-pronged. I've been taking some notes here because it's just so much information coming out of you. It's unreal. You've got such a wealth of knowledge. So safety and relief are the two big things, yeah. And for me, I add in care/love to that. I think that's the other thing that all living beings want to feel is care and love, which comes back to that social kind of connection, yeah?
Yeah, I think care and love are really important as far as seeking that safety and seeking the relief. Remember, relief is about, if you've already got, especially from the care and love, and you have that secure attachment, then there isn't then any relief seeking that you're looking at. Invariably is about returning back to your point of safety, which is that return to safety stuff. So yeah, completely agree. It's all very interconnected, all of it. And I think, and you're right, when I think back, as I say, my behavior changed based on those two inputs, both two extrinsic motivators of punishment and more positive stuff. But the real consequence for me was that drug addiction and breakdown some 15 years later. This is the point, as you say, and this is what we have to be mindful of when we're working with animals, that behavior change itself, just because we can change the behavior of another doesn't mean anything to that individual if they're still struggling to find that relief or whatever it is, and especially we know that especially with the Daniel Mills study that came out a few years ago, looking at dogs with challenging behaviours and finding that 80% of them had a physical pain component. Doesn't mean that was necessarily primary, but it was definitely an aggravator. We've got to make sure we're looking at that dog in a very kind of holistic way, really, and very much in the round.
Yeah, and another thing that I've found in my work over 30 years in practice, firstly, I got triggered into looking at neck and back pain by a fellow that had started working with horses, and he would anaesthetize the horses and bend their neck and mobilize the vertebrae, and these horses that had a forelimb lameness that they would have nerve blocked and x-rayed several times, sometimes couldn't find any reason, and deal with the nerve root compression, and suddenly the lameness goes away. And more than half of the animals that I see have significant pain that is totally invisible to their humans, soft tissue pain that's invisible to x-rays that vets aren't trained about, and vets miss all over the place too. So it's a huge problem.
Well, chronic pain is just so misunderstood, and myofascial stuff that you're talking about there, the kind of neuropathic stuff, and I do work with CAM, canine arthritis management, and I do a lot of work with Hannah, who's the vet there, and Dr. Amber Batson, who's amazing, Sarah Fisher, who's just absolutely amazing. If you've not had her as a guest, then please do, because I think you two would find loads to talk about on this stuff, because that's Sarah's bag, really, and how much actually damage we do is to horses and dogs just through the training process. Getting a dog looking up left all the time to get the treat and all this kind of stuff, and you're creating these kind of things. So, I would say of all the dogs I work with who are the most challenging, those kind of more dangerous dogs, if you like, I can't think of one in the last 10 years that wasn't in pain. Physical pain often, but as I say, emotional and social pain are equally as important, and it's often all connected, of course. This is the point. It's all connected.
And trauma, right? Which is kind of like, for me, trauma is physical, emotional, social pain that's got trapped in the body-mind system.
What a great way of seeing it. I think that's a good way of looking at it, I think. And, say Rachel Leather, who's I've done a lot of learning from on the trauma side of things, she doesn't make any real distinctions between working with humans and working with animals. A lot of the core things are the same that we have to look at, how we approach these things. And again, it's especially when you're having a trauma-informed approach, but it is allowing the other to behave, within the reasons, within the kind of confines of physical safety, of course, both for the animal and for us. But a good example, a dog who's quite shut down and maybe has come in a quite a traumatized state, as they start to find some of that confidence, and they start to connect to the caregiver, and they start to feel more able to express. Out of the blue, they suddenly start barking at the mailman, and then the temptation is to jump on the barking because I can't be barking. But actually, now the dog's like, I just felt safe enough to communicate, and now I don't feel safe again. And that's the thing about emotional safety, especially. There's two things about emotional safety. One is, this is very much applicable to us humans. I can't say it's necessarily the same for animals, but first is feeling safe to even feel, right? Oh my God, we've all been.
I personally think animals are much better at being with feelings and experiencing feelings than most humans. I think we've been socialized so heavily. Men are allowed to be angry, women are allowed to be sad, and that's about it in our society. But I honestly think animals have got a lot more emotional freedom than humans in a lot of ways, and unless humans have stuffed that up, of course.
That's a really good point. So if you listen to ethologists like Kim Brophy and Simone Gabois and others, there is hardly any dysregulation in the adult species in Mother Nature. And that's really amazing, because they're fighting for their life on a daily basis. But if you think about it, emotions, moods, feelings, behavior and consequences, if you think about all those together, Mother Nature has stitched those together nicely. So you feel stuff, you act on it. What's the consequence? Oh, I'm still alive. Phew, that's okay. That kind of. So it's quite simple. Yeah. Whereas, as you say, through our civilizing process, in inverted commas, we've detached behavior and consequence, because that we have to behave in a certain way, and the consequences are very much connected to behavior, not to actually how we feel. So you're absolutely right. Especially here in the kind of West, we have this now, especially in the UK, with our stiff upper lip kind of thing. You can feel what you like, but you just don't show it. And that's really damaging, and especially when you're being pushed to conformity, the kind of rich emotional, social peg that we have, square peg being pushed through a conformity round hole, it's quite damaging often. And our whole educational system is kind of is pushed onto this stuff as well. Even and there's a big friction between structured learning and experiential learning. There's a great little saying in human psychology again, which is there's a difference between what we are taught and what we learn, and that is hugely important. Perhaps some of the most damaging few words really is, well, they got to learn. They say that to the kids. When I was working with humans who had social anxieties, many could pinpoint back to their formative years in adolescence where they were forced into social engagement that they couldn't cope with because somebody felt, you've got to learn. Did they learn to be more sociable? No. Did they learn to be more safe to be sociable? No. They learned to mask better. They learned different coping mechanisms. And guess what? When they became adults and they had more agency, it's easy just not to turn up to social stuff than actually go through it again. So this is the thing. So this is what we're taught and what we learn. People think back to school days. We don't remember much of what we were taught as such. There'll be things that we do remember that had intrinsic value or really kind of inspirational teachers or whatever, but we are still affected by what we learned intrinsically a lot of the time, how we connected to our peers, how we connected to authority, how we connected to the learning experience. And that friction between attainment and achievement, if you imagine little Johnny is in school today, that's an achievement for him. It's an achievement for him because he didn't have breakfast this morning, or he didn't sleep last night, or he's traumatized by what's going on at home. Yeah. Because of that state, he can now not match what is needed from an attainment point of view within that class. So his behaviour will change.
His learning doors are closed.
Exactly. Yeah, he can't learn, and but he will be classed as being disruptive, naughty, difficult, challenging. This is the cycle, and it's enfranchised.
I went to boarding school and I won some year prizes for subjects in year 8. And by year 10, I had to repeat because I just hated it and I stopped doing anything. I just shut down.
And the problem there is, Edward, those around you saw you as being the problem.
Yep.
Not the other way around, which was the environment was the problem for you. And some of those needs that you needed, especially feeling safe. I was saying about the two things with emotional safety. One is feeling safe to even feel. The second one is feeling safe to communicate how you feel. Yeah. That is a big one. And this is a big one, especially I do emotional health kind of workshops for animal care professionals and within veterinary and within rescue.
Yep, both very challenging professions.
Very challenging professions, and where if you're in the wrong environment, if you're in the wrong culture where you're being told, look, be professional, which is a kind of way of saying, do as you're told, but be professional, don't get involved, don't get attached, don't be emotional. The problem is you're going to be all those things, but now you feel you can't talk about it. So you're now working in an emotionally unsafe environment.
Emotional safety for animals. Yeah, I suppose, I also think, so I mentioned when we were, just before we went live, that Lockie Phillips is a mentor of mine with emotional horsemanship. And he talks about dominant emotions and how they drive behaviour. Care drives one kind of behaviour, rage drives another, seeking drives another, lust drives another. I can't remember. I don't think I've got the whole list there. I haven't remembered them all. So I think that's interesting. I think that emotional states drive behaviour, and if we don't take that into account when we're trying to understand, and we, as a veterinarian, if I have an anxious animal come to me, an aggressive animal, well, we want to have behaviour modification. We want to have changes that make that dog a good, safe, and family member, but we don't want to just make it good and safe. We want the dog to be happy and secure and have a good internal experience at the same time. Yeah.
But that's why if we're going to provide safety for the animal, it has to be on their terms. It becomes more risky if we just change behaviour. because what will happen is behavior, the animal might adapt slightly, but then if some of the fundamental things haven't been addressed, then we're likely to get the behavior either come back or even more severe stuff that comes back. And this happens. This is definitely the case with punishment, of course, which is just a way of stopping any communication. But what you're saying about the different things, I think this very much falls into Panscape stuff with the 7 regions.
It is Panscape. Yeah, that's what it comes from.
And what's been interesting there is the one part of the brain that is always on is seeking. But
really?
It's always on. So seeking is the one that's always on. And this is, if we start thinking about things in relation, it's a bit geeky now, in relation to core affect space, how we plot mood state, and how we think about how different parts of the brain are activated. Seeking's on all the time, but it's dialed down until you want something, and then it's dialed up, and then it integrates in with other parts of the brain, that might come in. But this is very relevant, especially with a lot of aggressive behaviors come down to frustration, not being able to get what you're seeking.
Yeah.
So, and especially if you're seeking connection, seeking safety, seeking care,
seeking lust, seeking. They all. I'm just seeing this in a whole new way. They all have a seeking component, don't they?
They all have a seeking component, and they have to have. And what's really I've got my little kind of donut example here. So sat there quite nicely now. Sorry, everybody's going to be thinking about donuts now. But anyway, when you think you want a donut, your brain, your seeking circuit dials up now. It's like, right, I really want a donut.
Cinnamony, sugary, nice and hot.
And when the seeking circuits is fired up in that very specific way, it wants two outcomes. It either wants the donut, that's the ideal outcome, or it might settle for something that's a bit similar.
Yeah,
something that's like, say, sweet and hot and whatever it is that you like. Problem is, if it doesn't get those outcomes, the rage circuits will take over. Now that sounds very dramatic, but rage really is just frustration. Well, it's a lot of things, but
frustration is if you had a grade of 1 to 10 of rage, then frustration might be down 2 or 3. Yeah.
But frustration is really challenging because this is why children have tantrums, of course. And actually, a lot of studies have looked at kids, and just by providing young children with more choices and predictable outcomes has a marked reduction in tantrum-like behaviours.
Well, I've got about a year-old whippet, and she's a very active, very intelligent, very sensitive dog. And she's the first dog I've ever had that I've not used any kind of aversive stuff. My other dog's 14 years old, and I was still using physical punishment when he was a puppy. I didn't know better at that time. But on the weekend, we went for an extended walk, and she was on the lead the whole time. And she experienced quite vast amounts of frustration. But one of my things is I think that kind of frustration, allowing, if you don't let dogs find their way through frustration, they don't learn how to regulate either.
This is where it's a little bit tricky. It's a little bit tricky because learning to self-regulate is everything. And it's not an innate thing. We have to learn it. All juvenile mammals, I don't know, might be the same for other species, I don't know, the brains are designed to dysregulate.
Really?
Well, this is really important because there's a part of the brain, the modulating part of the brain, which helps us to regulate better. But it's very lacking because it's not connected and wired up. So for dogs specifically, then that part of the brain doesn't even start until 18 months.
Oh, really?
So when we think back to the doors of the brain analogy, for that adolescent dog, a lot of those dogs aren't even open yet, let alone being able to utilize them. And it kind of makes sense a little bit. So it's really hard for children to regulate well. So it's important. So yes, so a lot of this is why, coming back to attachment stuff, how important it is for us as the secure attachment to offer co-regulation in those formative, in the case of dogs, months, and in the case of children, years, to be able to hold space, to be able to allow the child to go through stress cycles. That's really important. But if you have I'm talking dogs now. a dog who's just constantly going through frustration. Everything's frustrating because they're not being able to do some of their breed specific stuff, some of their...
Oh yeah, and that is, I'm not doing that. That is not, you've got to only can have a dose of frustration. That would be what I think is healthy, right?
But it's better to provide an outcome because that helps the cycle. So if I'm working with a dog, for example, who really wants to kind of bark up a tree when it sees a squirrel, and they'll happily stay there barking for hours. The barking is coming from the fact that seeking circuits are involved. It can't get the donut, which is the squirrel, or anything like it. We have to provide, this is what we do with gun dog training, of course, because a lot of those seeking circuits, that we're using them very strongly, actually, for them to do the dog's work.
We want to activate them. We want to strengthen them and make them a real dominant feature, right?
But we also need to create an off switch for it. We need to create an outcome that reduces that nervous system, but gets the parasympathetic system back in going in, so we can get back to kind of a homeostasis process rather than just leaving the dog on a high. And it's the same with kids. They say, they say a lot of these kind of studies have been looked at, giving kids choices, giving them outcomes. We can all recognize the rage bit, because a really good example of this is if you go into a car park looking for a parking space, seeking circuits are fully on board now. If somebody pulls out of the one space, this is the worst of all scenarios now, seeking brains. Like, I've now seen the outcome. I know the outcome and I can have it. Brilliant. And then you're just about to pull in and some bugger pulls in ahead of you, right? You will feel that. Exactly. You will feel it. Now, most of us, the majority of us, we might get a bit fruity with our language or give some hand gestures. But that's it, because we can regulate back. Some people get out of their car.
One of these violent men that's had a life where they've never had any care and blah, 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 blah. Maybe they get out of the car and murder them, right?
Well, that's the other extreme. But even those who have struggled to learn to regulate well and are at the mercy of some of those kind of base emotions, and it's hard for them to get back to a kind of a homeostatic baseline. We understand the importance of co-regulation. So again, Mary Ainsworth saw this a lot when she was over in Africa. She's in Uganda specifically. Mm-hmm. Seeing how well they held space for the young children and allowed the children to feel stuff. And remember, emotional safety, being safe to feel and to communicate how you feel. So I think all these things are important for us. And when we start thinking this, we think, right, we need to start thinking about things differently then for the early development of the dogs that come into our lives. The training, as in traditional functional training, sit down, come, stay, whatever. Actually, I'm not saying we shouldn't do training, but rather than be the most important thing, is actually the add-on bit. It's the extra bit, and it can wait, actually. It can wait. This notion
I really think what I want to teach more than anything else with dogs is regulation, self-regulation. And, dopamine is the seeking hormone and oxytocin is the regulation hormone. So I'm very, very... I really want to trigger oxytocin, but not only in the animal, but in the human. And the way that I've managed to stumble on that I found is very effective for this is certain qualities of touch, relaxing touch. And you can help a dog regulate and learn to regulate with touch. It's a really interesting thing.
And there's a lot of crossovers there again with children.
Yeah.
Yeah, hugely. And
weighted
I think
blankets and firm hugs and all those kinds of things, yeah?
And the nervous system feeling the quality of the presence of another.
Yes.
Which is important, isn't it? Because one thing we know with babies, which is really interesting. So Jennifer Shyrock, is a great educator. She does a lot of, she came from child development, working with children, and works with dogs now, but specialises in working with dogs and children.
Oh, goodness, I must give me her context. Well, we should get her on the pod.
Yes. We used to think that, babies are just a mushy brain, right? And they're all like goo goo gaga, and they're not able to think and whatever. What we now know is that the nervous system is the thing that's already well developed.
Yeah.
Even prenatal. So whilst the brain might not be doing much, the nervous system is learning all the time. And this is so, and because it has to, right? And because if you think about it, if that baby's going to have to make a connection, and it has to feel safe, and it connects to mom, and we know that, my sister, when her kids were growing up, they didn't want Uncle Andy, that's for sure. They didn't feel the quality of my presence because they screamed their eyes out whenever I picked them up. But so it's important, isn't it? I think so. Touch is everything. What makes it? A lot of the stuff, we talk about learned behaviour all the time. A lot of the things, especially with the dogs I work with, the learned behaviour isn't from a cognitive base. It is more from a nervous system base. And we can change things cognitively, but if that nervous system doesn't believe it, if that nervous system doesn't feel safe, it will override the cognitive stuff, and it does.
Yeah, and the emotional states, I think the nervous system is driven more by the emotional experiences than the cognitive. I think that's a deeper layer, yeah?
100%, and this is almost the friction. In the human psychology world, you have those who are very much into, if you think it, it'll happen. And then you have, and I get that to a point, but the point here is there is no one answer. That is the biggest thing. The most important thing I would invite everybody today is just stay humble enough to think there's something more to learn.
Yes,
especially about the lived experience of another, let alone the lived experience of our own, and to give ourselves grace actually for our own lived experience, actually, because the reason that I share about my own kind of challenges, if it's when it's relevant, is because being vulnerable like that is the best antidote to shame. And
well, it is, and though growing up on the cattle property was lovely, there was incredible violence towards animals, which left a great amount of trauma in my system. And we had a head stockman who had a very traumatized background and traumatic brain injury, and was extremely volatile and would go off the handle screaming at things all the time. So, and then went to boarding school, and I ended up, my collapse was chronic fatigue for 20 years. So my nervous system and my immune system just got fried to the point where I got really sick. And I had a marijuana addiction for quite a number of years too. So I understand from a lived perspective that I've had to learn how to self-regulate. And I think one of the things that I've found really important in that is to build an appetite for what I call healthy discomfort. And I think this is a principle we can apply with animals too. Little doses of frustration so they learn how to regulate through that and come out the other side and help them co-regulate with us and that sort of thing. But I know I wouldn't have got well if I hadn't been able to do hard things like get up and exercise every morning and work with therapists to go through my uncomfortable stuff and assimilate and integrate trauma and all that,
Yeah, and I think, there's an element of almost reparenting for ourselves.
Yeah.
And definitely for me, everything is about our relationship with stuff.
Yes.
So it's not about not feeling, it's about changing our relationship with it, changing our relationship with our trauma, changing our relationship with the world around us, all these kind of things. I think there's some, it's only my opinion, but I think some of the advice that gets given out there for people isn't very helpful when it's about trying to push away stuff. Emotions and feelings and our mood state, we talk about mood, emotion, feelings interchangeably. They're very separate. But we have this for a reason. And when you think about it, Mother Nature is the one thing that has gone through millions and millions of years of evolution, that side of things. We were all a nerve net once, which was the first kind of thing that became a nervous system. The kind of prefrontal cortex came along a lot later. So for Mother Nature, then emotions kind of work. They have a reason. As you said earlier, we've kind of detached ourselves from a lot of stuff as we become more in inverted commas civilized. And it's not healthy. And it's a case of sitting with stuff. There are things that I know I still find triggering. There are things that I know that I know are difficult for me. But I won't say I welcome the feelings, but I know them now.
I don't welcome them, but I will embrace them.
Yeah. And it's as well as self-regulation, but I think it's our improved self-awareness through that process. Yeah. Really.
Look, I'd love, I mean, we could talk for days, I reckon, but I would love to just talk a little bit about the whole alpha thing, which I think is just one of the greatest disservices we've done to the canine kingdom possible. And I also want to talk a little bit about the possible harm of positive reinforcement.
Well, the dominance thing is a very easy thing. All these things we can dive down rabbit holes, but I think the history of that really is because of the wolf studies back in the day. David Meck is the name that kind of comes to mind, but where they looked at wolves and they were like, yeah, there's definitely a hierarchy here, and we're going to name the top ones as alpha, and we're going to, and this notion of rank. Hi, who's that? Who's that?
This is Jem. Nearly always comes and joins us in the podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll be able to see Jem. If not, she's just jumped up to say hello. She's a very lively, very loving little whippet.
Oh, she's absolutely adorable. And I love her name too. She looks like a gem. A lot of things about kind of rank and about all these kind of things. And then the word dominance got attached to that because of how I'm not comfortable with the word dominance, period, really. I think it's a very human kind of creation, really, how we look at stuff. And they use it in other times. But anyway, ethology has a different way of looking at dominance or context. But so these studies came out, the dog training world at the time, which was very kind of authoritarian and very kind of punitive in nature. It's like, oh yeah, dogs, wolves, very similar. We've got to make sure we're the boss, so we've got to put them in their place, and they better do as they're told, all that kind of stuff. So it all kind of set. I think also at the same time we had a big explosion in the marketing world when you think about the 50s and 60s, and what we know, these are just my extra bits I'm throwing in here, but we know when we think about the behavioural kind of scientists who are behind marketing, they found that men were quite hard to sell to.
Yes.
This theory came along about alpha, right? Pack leader. And it was a big explosion of a lot of advertising in that period, utilizing this notion of being the alpha, being the whatever. So it really takes hold, right?
Whole toxic masculinity, aggressive Western Anglo-Saxon invasion, overtaking, colonization kind of cultural thing, yeah?
100%. And that is still what I feel part of the problem we've got with even just aversive trading more generally, but especially the dominance thing. But David Mack, who kind of came out with that stuff, he brought out another paper or book or whatever it was, some 5 or 6 years later, saying, I got all that wrong, actually, because I was...
Well, he did, because the other thing about it was that the wolves were contained within an enclosure, so the adolescent males couldn't move away, which is what drove a lot of the aggressive behaviour, which you don't see in a family pack, which is really a family unit with 2 elders and a whole lot of loving, caring, deferent kind of behaviours.
And they were wolves from multiple family units because they were all put together artificially in a zoo setting.
Oh, I didn't know that. That makes it even worse.
Even worse. Well, we only have to. I don't know whether you have Big Brother over there, the TV show, but you only have to. Yeah, with the humans, you only have to put people from different family units into a space where you can't get away, and you will end up with a pecking order of some sort. So when he studied wolves in nature, he's like, actually, yeah, this is more deferential. It's a family unit. And they don't even call them alpha anymore. They call them the primary breeding pair. And so when you think about what that translated to then into human things, it's like you must go through the door first, you must eat first. It's just rubbish, and it stopped the dog's ability to be able to communicate all those really important needs and try and make a secure attachment. And also I think another problem we've still got in dog training, which we're moving away from. My platform is called Dog-Centered Care, and I took that title really from child-centered care, the child-centered care movement, the progressive side of child educational psychology and development, where I get a lot of my kind of inspiration from, really. But we used to have children should be seen, not heard, right? And this was very much based on that kind of good, bad continuum, and also the normalization of pain in discipline. I had the cane, right? It was normalised.
You're told, or I will whack you.
Exactly. And over here in the UK, we have a ban on, corporal punishment, and also on certain levels of smacking, and they're looking at actually banning smacking period. In the dog world, I think the perpetuation of this normalization of pain is still being pushed, and I think
shock collars, god damn it.
Shock collars are a big example.
Yeah.
So I'm looking,
I'm just going to divert a little bit here, but there's some really interesting thing that came out of studying wild dogs in Africa. They noticed this huffing or sneezing behavior, like a kind of thing. They tried to work out what it was. Well, it turns out it's let's go hunting. But in that pack, if the lead dogs didn't want to go hunting, about 70% of them would have to display this behavior. If the lead dogs did want to go hunting, only about 30% would have to display that behavior. And when I do it to my dogs, they go, whoa, and get really excited. It's really interesting. I just thought I'd throw that in because it's kind of fun.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think for me, I think especially, I don't know if you've heard of Sindor Pangal over in India. She's doing amazing stuff with looking at the streeties over there and how they interact and how they work socially, and moving away, very much away from a lot of the kind of dominance, hierarchical
I'd say, going to Bali and Peru, which are two countries I've gone to, they've got a lot of street dogs. They're very harmonious.
And there's hardly any conflict between them because they're regulating well. This is about, they work stuff out. They're like, well, I don't know who you are. Let me just back off. Let me work it out. They're not already pumped up and they're charging over. I live on a beach down here in Devon in the UK, and the dogs are all over. Well, exactly. The dogs are running around like crazy. They're not doing any threat evaluation or anything, and it's no wonder they end up barking to them, getting into scraps all the time because they're all over the shop. And actually, heavy extrinsic motivation through training is not going to help a dog intrinsically regulate well.
No, actually, my thing is that treats are stimulating, and they are kind of the opposite of regulating in a way. And I will use them, but I tend to want to use touch and communication as my primary modes of working with and helping dogs heal and learn how to regulate.
I hear you on that, and I think this is the thing. It's about having a relationship, isn't it? It's about for me, everything's a request. Everything's a request. People can call it a command or a cue, but for me, it's a request. And because the dog will either do it or they won't. That's the reality. And we need to be available to that feedback that we get. We need to allow, everything is an invitation.
Yes, and if the dog says no, well, then you just got to do a better job of inspiring them. It's not your job to punish them. It's your job to get better.
Yeah, or to work out why. Most of the time, it's not because they won't, it's because they can't. They don't have their doors open, they're preoccupied with something else. Their nervous system is focused on something else in the environment that is more important to them at that moment. And we just got to get better at picking up on the cues from the dog, not for them to pick up on cues from us. So we can understand, actually, do you know what? You are well-regulated, you're old enough, you're good at learning, let's go and do some, let's go and have some fun in a teaching point of view. And understanding our dogs in that way, it's a beautiful thing, I think, to have that kind of more relational approach, I think.
Relationship first is my whole thing with animals, with people, with all the living energies of the world. I think it is the essence of a life well lived, is a continual growth into stronger, better relationships.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay, I think it's time for us to wrap up. We're going to close up with just two questions. First one is the wake-up call. What do you think is humanity's biggest blind spot when it comes to our shared journey of evolution, healing, and wellness?
I think that good bad continuum doesn't help, the way that we see behaviour in a very arbitrary way. But I think also the othering, the notion of othering, because which fits in with that. It fits in with everything we've talked about, actually, from us as a social species, because part of our brain wants to find social safety, so we will seek similarities, of course. But we've ended up with, especially political classes, that want to make a lot of things about blaming others for stuff. And I think that othering, that dehumanizing, it's a scary thing. And I think the world at the moment, Edward, on many levels, is showing us that it's still very alive and well, sadly.
Oh, yes. Yes, I think that is true, and I think it's very scary.
And the political chatterings that create a lot of this, we've had it here in the UK, happening in America now, is the symptom, actually, not necessarily the cause. And I think we have to think about the disenfranchisement of many people because they don't feel safe emotionally or socially.
That we need to stop billionaires taking 95% of the wealth and everyone else being poor and struggling. You know, I think that's probably the other thing, is that there's just an incredible lack of care and generosity when it comes to how resources are distributed among the world.
Definitely. And this is part of that disenfranchisement for people, I think. You know, and so I think that's I've got my CAKE acronym because we all love cake, right? Compassion, awareness, knowledge, and empathy. And I think I think it's important to try and bring CAKE. And the thing about compassion for others, you know, compassion isn't about condoning. It isn't about approving. It's about turning up anyway. And I think that's an important thing for us. You know, the example I gave earlier with my husband, he was very aware of the person he was caring for and what their offences were. And his compassion was not a way of approving. It was, I will turn up anyway. And the awareness, truly trying to be aware of the lived experience of another, to try and bypass our own distortions and our own biases. It's not easy, Edward. It's not easy. Do you know what? Trying to be like this in the way that you and I want to try and live our lives isn't easy. It takes work, and there's a lot of things we have to navigate. And I think, sadly, within some areas of society, viewing things this way is somehow seen as being snowflakey or whatever. But
don't get me started on how you're denigrated for compassion by being a snowflake or a communist because you want to have some kind of progressive policies that actually care for everyone equally. It gets me a little hot under the collar.
Well, I hear you. I think it's the pinnacle of human existence. It's easy to be driven by instant judgments and lack of awareness. So it's easy to do. That's the easy way. So, compassion, awareness, and then knowledge, genuinely seeking knowledge of the other. Yeah. Not the knowledge we have. And then I think that allows more of the chance of a right, of bringing in empathy, you know. But, so that's our pay grade. All we can do is try and do our bit, I think. But I do have, but having said that, I just want to say this, I do still have faith. You know, over here in the UK, we had these riots not so long ago, very much driven by the far right, and it was all pretty horrendous. But you know what? The people who came out to clear up after the riots and the masses of people that came out against that rhetoric, that's where hope lies. Hope lied within those crowds for me.
Yeah, I hear you, and I think that is definitely something that human nature, there's a lot of good in it. And the final question is, what is the change that you want to be and inspires others to be in this world, which I think you've kind of almost answered in the answer to the first question in a way.
To be honest, all I want to do with anything I do really is to invite others. It's not to think differently necessarily, but to feel differently about stuff. I think if we feel a bit differently, there's a great Marcel Proust quote, which is the kind of journey of discovery isn't about finding new landscapes, but having new eyes or something like that. And I think it's one of the most fundamental kind of foundations to in human psychology is perception truly is everything. How we perceive something drives our response. How we perceive others, how we perceive the behaviour of others, and importantly, how we perceive ourselves. Right. So I just, these conversations are great, but because it's not a case saying do this, do that. It's a case of let's think about some stuff. Yeah, because it's complicated.
Let's be curious. Let's be curious and think and explore and learn. Thank you so much. This has been a fascinating conversation today. And Andrew, where can people find you?
So Dog Centre Care on Facebook and also my Dog Centre Care YouTube channel where I get to speak to a lot of amazing people, and it'd be great to have you as a guest on my platform.
Love to come on.
A lot of the people I've talked about here, Sindor and Sarah and others, they're all on the YouTube channel. And dogcc.org is my website if people want to hear a bit more about me and my stuff.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. We will press stop on the recording now, and hopefully we'll see you in the next episode. Just taking a short little break from the actual podcast itself. Thanks so much for listening. I just wanted to let you know that I have a modality, whole energy body balance, that I've created over 28 years of working with all kinds of animals with all kinds of problems. And if you want to learn how to get your beautiful hands on your pets to find and heal their silent pain, anxiety and trauma, or if you would like to wake up your intuitive perception and learn how to use energy healing to find and heal all kinds of problems and distresses and traumas in your pet's energy systems, then pop into wholeenergybodybalance.com. We've got home and practitioner programs so you can learn either to help your pets or you can get certified and build a beautiful business out playing with dogs and cats all day. It's a stack of fun. And now we'll head back to the podcast.